Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Access Arabic. Today we continue with our Tajweed workshop series. We're still on the videos of Sifat al-Huruf. Today we begin with module 11 inshallah. Sifat al-Huruf, those without opposites. In the previous videos we've covered those 10 Sifat with opposites. Now we move on to those Sifat that are standalone, those Sifat with no opposite. So without further ado, let's jump straight into it. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Amma ba'd. So we've mentioned in previous videos that the characteristics, sifat of letters, are what distinguish one letter from the other that share the same makhraj. So sifat differentiate between the letters that come from the same place in the mouth. Every letter has at least 5 different sifat, and applying the sifat of each letter properly is what distinguishes the good qari, the good reciter, from the average. We mentioned that sifat are divided into 2 groups, those with opposites, which we've covered in the previous videos, and those without opposites, which we will cover in this video inshallah. So there are 8 sifat without opposites. These are standalone sifat that do not come in pairs, yani they do not have an opposite. These are as-safir, the whistle, al-leen, softness, al-inhiraf, to drift, at-takrar, repetition, at-tafashi, to spread around, al-istitala, lengthening, al-ghunna, nasalization, and al-qalqala, the echo. So we will begin with sifa with our opposite, number 1, as-safir. Safir refers to the natural whistling sound that is emitted when pronouncing sin, sad, and za. You'll notice whenever you pronounce the sin, s, s, as, there is a whistling sound. Likewise with the sad, s, 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 sad, sad, as, s, 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 as, there is a whistling sound. And likewise with the za, za, z, z, az, there is a whistling sound. So safir refers to the natural whistling sound that is emitted when pronouncing the sin, sad, or za. If there is no whistling sound being pronounced when you recite these words, then it means you are pronouncing the letters a bit wrong, because sin, sad, and za are sifat. They are the internal characteristics of the letters, and sifat is what differentiates one letter from the next. And now we move on to number 2, which is leen. Leen refers to the inherent ease and softness that's present in the letters waw and ya whenever they are sakina and have a fatha before them. Aw, ay. These are very, very soft, gentle letters. They just come out of the mouth. They are layyin, they are leen. They have the sifa, the characteristic of leen. They have layana. They are just easy and soft, gentle letters to pronounce. So waw and ya have the sifa, the internal characteristic of softness, and it comes mostly into fruition. It's most apparent whenever they are sakina with a fatha before them, such as this, aw and a. Aw, a. There is just a inherent softness in them. A, bay, tay, aw, bow, taw. And now we move on to sifa with our opposite, number 3, inhiraf. So inhiraf means to drift. It is the slight drifting of our tongue to the makhraj of ra whenever we pronounce lam, and to lam whenever we pronounce ra. So it applies to 2 letters. It applies to lam and it applies to ra. Whenever we pronounce the letter lam, there's a slight drifting of our tongue towards the makhraj of ra. And whenever we pronounce ra, there's a slight drifting of our tongue to the makhraj, the articulation point of lam. And as always, it is most noticeable whenever we make the letter sakina and then put haraka before it. So for example, we have here ar, ur, and id. And we have al, ul, and il. Ar, ur, id, al, ul, il. Whenever we pronounce these letters, you will notice there is a slight drifting of the tongue from the makhraj of ra to lam and lam to ra. And now we move on to sifa with our opposite, number 4, which is takrar. Takrar means repetition. It is the trilling, the movement of the tongue when pronouncing the ra. R, r. You will notice r, 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 ra, r. whenever we pronounce any letter, for example, L, Ash, As, F, the sound continues, but with Ra, our tongue moves, it trills. R, Ra, Ri, this is called takrar. There is some scholarly difference of opinion on whether or not this trilling, this takrar, should be completely avoided, meaning that Ra is the only sifa that we should completely avoid. Our tongue should not trill, it should not go r when pronouncing the letter Ra. Whereas some other scholars are of a different view. They believe that the trilling, the repetition of our tongue when pronouncing the Ra is completely unavoidable. They are of the view that this is an intrinsic characteristic of the Ra which cannot be avoided but should be limited. We shouldn't make it completely trill. So when pronouncing the Ra, we shouldn't say Ar-Rahman or Ar-Rahman, because this is too much. It means we're pronouncing multiple Ra's. Personally, with my ustads, we followed the view that the Ra is a sifa which should be avoided. So when I recite the Quran, I avoid takrar. Whenever I recite the Quran, I do not do takrar. For example, Ar-Rahman, I'm avoiding the trilling, while some ulama are of the view that it can trill a little bit. For example, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahman. Here there's a little bit of trilling, but no one says you can trill it completely. For example, Ar-Rahman. This is completely not allowed. And of course, as with all things, Allah Azza wa Jal knows best. And now we move on to sifa with opposite number 5, tafashi. So tafashi is the spreading around of the sound of the letter sheen within our mouth when pronouncing it. Sheen is a very powerful sound. Sh, sh, ash, ush, ish, sh, sh. Whenever we pronounce it, the sound is spread within our whole mouth. This sifa is called tafashi. So we shouldn't make the sheen weak. We shouldn't do the opposite of tafashi. We shouldn't just say shi, shi, sha, shu, shi, ash, ush, ish, ash, 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 ash. No, we should make it strong. Ash, ush, ish. We need to give every letter its right. So remember, we shouldn't pronounce the sheen as ash, ash, ush, ish, sha, shu, shi. No, sheen is we need to give every letter its right, and sheen has the sifa, the characteristic of tafashi. Ash, ush, ish, sha, shu, shi, sha, shu, shi. When we pronounce it, remember tafashi is the spreading around of the sound of the letter sheen in the mouth when pronouncing it. And now we move on to sifa number 6, al-istitala. Istitala is the extended pronunciation of the dad when it has a sakina or a shadda on it, until the tip of the tongue slightly reaches the gum line in front of the mouth. It only applies to the letter dad. So whenever dad has a sukoon, so whenever it is sakina or whenever it has a shadda, whenever it is mushaddada, we extend the pronunciation of the dad, bearing in mind as well that it is also rahawa, so the sound is extended. But with dad, we extend the pronunciation of dad whenever it is sakina or mushaddada until the tip of the tongue slightly touches the gum line in front of the mouth. This is why whenever many expert reciters of the Quran recite, you'll notice it seems like there's a little bit of a bubble in their mouth when they're pronouncing the dad. And when you're reciting it yourself, you can feel the sound move from the side of the mouth to the tip, similar to inhiraf. Whereas the makhraj, the house, the articulation point of the dad is here. The side of the teeth will touch the top, it will touch the molars, right? Da. But whenever it has a sakina or whenever it is mushaddada, we have to hold it and extend it a little bit. We will feel the sound travel from the side of our tongue to the tip of our tongue until the tongue lightly touches the gum line at the front of the mouth. So this is partly due to its sifa of itbaq, And as it is a rakhawa letter, it should be held as long as any other rakhawa letter. So we shouldn't hold it longer than the rest of the rakhawa letters. For example, as. We won't say al. First and foremost, as you can see, I struggle to say that. It's not possible to do that. If you're applying the itbaq and the sifat of huruf properly, you'll notice it's not possible to do it. But for the sake of clarity, I of course need to mention that it is a rakhawa letter, so it should not be held for longer than other rakhawa letters. One thing that is worth mentioning is that Arabic is lughatul dad. It is known as the language of dad. The reason for this is because dad is a inherently unique sound to the Arabic language. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was known as khayru man nataqa bil dad, the best of those to pronounce the dad. We might not pronounce the dad perfect, but we should try and perfect it. We should try our best to pronounce the letter dad, because as I said, dad is unique to Arabic, and it should not be pronounced as the way we do in general conversation or in Ammiya. Often instead of saying dad, we will say dha or za, bizabt or bilzabt, for example. We shouldn't pronounce it like this. Whenever we are reciting the glorious Qur'an, this is kalamullah. This is the glorious speech of Allah Azza wa Jal. Of course, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is khayru man nataqa bil dad. We will not pronounce the dad perfectly like he did, but we should try our utmost best to pronounce it properly. And this is why we should do the istitala, the itbaq, the rakhawa, and so on and so forth. But we are reciting the words of Allah Kareem Azza wa Jal. And now we move on to sifa number 7. Sifa without opposite number 7 is ghunna. Ghunna, as we've covered many times, and as you should know by now inshallah, is nasalization. It is the sound coming from the nose, and you may have guessed it, it applies to the noon and the meme. So ghunna, the nasal sound, is an inherent part of the noon and the meme. Whenever we recite noon and meme, there's always a little bit of ghunna. Na, ma, an. There's always a little bit of ghunna. But of course, this does not mean that we should stretch it for 2 harakat or 4 harakat or 6 harakat. That is separate. That's different rules which apply whenever noon or meme are sakina or whenever there's tanween. And now inshallah you're at that level where you can start to figure it out why. The reason why we have the rules of ikhfa, idhar, iqlab, idgham is because nasalization is an inherent part of the characteristics of noon and meme. They are inherent sifat of noon and meme. So in some situations we extend this ghunna, and in others we don't. For example, idhar. But regardless, there's still always a little bit of ghunna, and this is also why they have the sifat of tawassut. When we read the noon and the meme whenever they are sakina, and we hold them for a little bit. Of course, not as long as the rakhawa, but we still hold them for a little bit. We can never avoid this ghunna. The only way to avoid it would be to pronounce it as a different letter. But the sifat of huruf is part of giving every letter its haqq. I'ta'ul hurufi haqqaha. And now we move on to sifa number 8, which is qalqala. Qalqala, you are very familiar with this too because we've covered it previously. Qalqala is the echoing sound. It is the inherent vibrating quality found in qutbu jaddin, qaf, ta, ba, jim and dal whenever they are sakina. So whenever these 5 letters have a sukoon on them, whenever they are sakina, it is impossible to avoid qalqala. For example, aqo, apo, ab, aj, ad. It is inherently impossible to avoid it. We can't say aj as hard as we try. Aq, aj, ad, ab, ad. We can't avoid the qalqala. These are inherent characteristic of these 5 letters whenever they have a sukoon on them. So to recap, in this video we've covered that there are 8 sifats without opposites. Safir is the natural whistling sound which applies to the seen, the sad and za. We've also covered lean, which is an inherent softness in waw and ya, particularly when they are sakina with a fatha before them. We mentioned that inhiraf is a drifting of the tongue from the makhraj of the ra to the lam, or the lam to the ra. So it applies to ra and lam. We mentioned takrar is repetition. It only applies to the ra, and there is difference of opinion as regards to whether this is a sifa that should be completely avoided or should be minimized. We've also covered at-tafashi, which is the spreading around of the sound of the sheen within the mouth. We mentioned istitala, which is the extending or the lengthening of the dad whenever it is sakina or mushaddada, whenever it has a sukoon or a shadda on it. We mentioned that. We've also learned al-ghunna, which is the inherent nasalization sound found in the noon and the meme, and we've also covered qalqala, which is the inherent bouncing sound found in the qaf, ta, ba, jim and dal whenever they have a sukoon on them, whenever they are sakinah. And in the previous videos we also covered that there are 10 sifat with opposites. So that brings the total number of sifat to 18. 10 plus 8 equals 18. 10 with opposites, 8 without opposites. And we mentioned that the 10 pairs of sifat with opposites were hamsan jahar, shidda and rakhawa, isti'la and istifal, itbaq and infitah, and then we had idlaq and ismat, regards which there is difference of opinion whether they are sifat or not. We mentioned that the letters of hams and jahar, we mentioned that the letters of hams were fahathahu shakhsun sakat, and the letters of jahar were everything else. The letters of shidda were ajidu qit bakat, and the letters of rakhawa were everything else except for tawassut, which is in between rakhawa and shidda, which was lin umar. We mentioned the letters of isti'la, khussa, daghdin, qidh, the full mouth letters. The letters of istifal were everything else. The letters of itbaq were sad, dad, ta and dha. The letters of infitah were everything else, and the letters of idlaq were farra, min, lub, and the letters of ismat were everything else. And with that, alhamdulillah, we've covered sifat al-huruf. So that brings us to the end of this video. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and to share so we can all share in the rewards. And as always, if you have any questions, you have the Telegram chat, you can ask a question in the comment section below and I will get back to you inshallah. But that's it from me. Take care and I'll see you on the other side inshallah. Ma'as salama.